In the sultry summer of 1903, when the Louisiana bayous lay thick with mist and the air hummed with mosquitoes and ancient secrets, there lived a woman whose very name was spoken only in whispers throughout the parishes of St. Martin and Iberville. They called her the Swamp Lady, though few knew her true identity, and fewer still dared to venture into the moss-draped wilderness where she made her home among the cypress trees and Spanish moss that hung like ghostly veils in the perpetual twilight of the wetlands. The woman who would become legend had arrived in these forgotten waterways sometime in the 1880s, appearing as suddenly and mysteriously as morning fog rising from the dark waters. Local Creole families, whose ancestors had fished and trapped in these swamps for generations, first encountered her poling a weathered pirogue through channels that most considered impassable. She was tall and angular, with steel-grey hair braided with marsh grass and eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over the Gulf. Her skin bore the deep bronze of someone who had lived under the Louisiana sun for decades, yet no one could recall her youth or remember when she had first come to claim the 1,000 acres of seemingly worthless swampland that would become her domain. The land itself was considered cursed by many of the local inhabitants. It lay in a bend of the Atchafalaya Basin where the waters ran dark as coffee and strange lights danced among the cypress knees on moonless nights. Trappers spoke of compasses spinning wildly in that region, of boats that entered the maze of waterways only to emerge days later with their occupants bearing no memory of where they had been. The Acadian families who had settled the area after their expulsion from Nova Scotia crossed themselves when speaking of that particular stretch of bayou, and even the boldest hunters would not pursue game that fled into its shadowy depths. Yet it was precisely this feared and avoided territory that the woman claimed as her own, building a cabin on stilts in the heart of the swamp where the waters never fully receded and the distinction between land and water became meaningless. She lived alone, tending gardens that grew in defiance of every agricultural principle known to the region, cultivating plants that bloomed out of season and bore fruit that glowed with phosphorescent light in the darkness of the bayou nights. The local French and Creole communities, bound together by generations of shared hardship and mutual dependence, initially regarded the newcomer with the suspicious tolerance typically reserved for harmless eccentrics. She traded occasionally with the settlements, bringing mysterious herbs and roots that the old women valued for their healing properties, accepting in return only salt, iron nails, and certain types of wood that she specified with exacting precision. Her French was fluent but archaic, spoken with an accent that suggested origins far from Louisiana, perhaps the Caribbean islands or even older places where French was mixed with languages that predated European colonization. Madame Célestine Boudreau, the acknowledged wise woman of the closest settlement, had been among the first to establish contact with the enigmatic stranger. Her journal, discovered decades later in the attic of her grandson's house, provides one of the few first-hand accounts of those early encounters. "She knows things," Celestine wrote in her careful script, "things that no Christian woman should know, yet she uses her knowledge to heal rather than harm. The children of the Thibodeau family were dying of the fever that took so many that terrible summer, and nothing I could do would break it. She came to me in a dream, this strange woman from the deep swamp, and showed me which roots to gather and how to prepare them. When I followed her instructions, the fever broke within hours, and the children recovered completely." But it was Celestine's final entry about the Swamp Lady that proved most prophetic. "There is a darkness gathering in the world beyond our bayous," she tells me. "Men from the cities with papers and deeds, men who see only money where we see home. She says they will come soon, and when they do, the old ways will be tested. She asks me to remember her words. The land protects those who protect the land, but the price of such protection is higher than most are willing to pay." The darkness Celestine referenced began to manifest in 1902, when representatives of the Louisiana Cypress Lumber Company arrived in the region with surveying equipment and legal documents that claimed vast stretches of swampland under eminent domain provisions. The company, backed by northern investors and armed with state legislation designed to encourage industrial development, intended to drain the wetlands and harvest the ancient cypress trees that had stood for centuries, transforming the entire ecosystem into profit margins and railroad ties. The local communities found themselves powerless against the combination of legal authority and financial influence that the lumber company wielded. Families who had lived on their land for generations discovered that their informal claims, based on oral tradition and community recognition, held no weight against corporate deeds registered in distant courthouses. The Acadian and Creole settlers, already marginalized by language barriers and cultural differences, watched helplessly as their ancestral home was parceled out to strangers who saw the bayou as nothing more than an obstacle to be overcome. It was during this time of mounting crisis that the Swamp Lady's true nature began to reveal itself. The first sign that something extraordinary was occurring came when the lumber company's initial surveying expedition failed to return from their exploration of the deeper swamp regions. 3 men had entered the maze of waterways with enough supplies for a week of work, equipped with the finest surveying instruments money could buy and accompanied by local guides who knew every channel and sandbar in the area. When search parties found their abandoned boat 5 days later, it was drifting empty in a circular lagoon that the guides swore had not existed the week before. The surveying equipment lay scattered on the boat's bottom, the precision instruments twisted into impossible shapes as if subjected to tremendous pressure. Most disturbing of all, the men's personal belongings remained untouched. Their money, their watches, even their tobacco and whiskey, suggesting that whatever had happened to them had not been the work of ordinary thieves or hostile locals. The guides who had accompanied the expedition were found 3 days later, wandering through the town of St. Martinville in a state of complete bewilderment. They retained no memory of what had occurred after entering the deep swamp, speaking only of strange music that seemed to rise from the water itself and lights that danced between the trees in patterns that hurt to watch directly. When pressed for details about the missing surveyors, they could only shake their heads and repeat the same phrase in broken English. The water took them. The lady, she sang them down. Dr. Henry Landry, the physician who examined the returned guides, noted in his medical records that all 3 men showed signs of prolonged exposure to something that had affected their nervous systems in ways he could not explain. Their pupils respond normally to light, he wrote, yet they seem to see things that are not there, speaking to empty air as if carrying on conversations with invisible companions. Most troubling, when I hold a mirror before them, they show no recognition of their own reflections, as if some essential part of their identity has been stripped away. The lumber company's response to the loss of their surveying team was swift and decisive. They hired armed guards from New Orleans, men with reputations for handling labor disputes and territorial conflicts with methods that skirted the edges of legality. These mercenaries arrived in the bayou country with modern weapons and explicit instructions to clear the swamps of any obstacles to the company's operations, whether those obstacles were human, animal, or something else entirely. As we delve deeper into this dark chapter of Louisiana's history, I invite you to share your thoughts about what protective forces might dwell in the world's forgotten places. Subscribe to our channel to join our community of mystery seekers, and let us know in the comments what other secrets you believe these ancient lands might hold. The confrontation between industrial ambition and primordial power began on a muggy Tuesday morning in late July, when the lumber company's hired guns entered the Swamp Lady's territory with boats laden with dynamite and cutting equipment. Their plan was straightforward: blast channels through the maze of waterways to allow access for the heavy machinery that would transform the wetlands into a profitable timber operation. What they encountered instead would become the subject of whispered stories for generations to come. Pierre Trosclair, the youngest of the hired guards, survived the expedition that followed, though he spent the remainder of his life in the state asylum at Jackson, speaking in fragmented sentences about things that medical science of the early 20th century had no framework to understand. His testimony, recorded by Dr. Emile Dufresne in the weeks following the incident, provides the only eyewitness account of what transpired in the heart of the Swamp Lady's domain. "She was waiting for us," Trosclair told Dr. Dufresne during one of his lucid moments. Standing on the water like it was solid ground, her arms raised to the sky and her mouth moving in words that made the air itself shiver. The trees began to move, not from wind but from something else, something that came up from the roots and spread through the branches like fire through dry grass. The water around our boat started to glow, first pale like moonlight, then brighter and brighter until we couldn't look directly at it. According to Trosclair's fragmented account, the Swamp Lady had indeed been expecting the lumber company's assault on her domain. She had spent weeks preparing for their arrival, gathering materials from throughout the bayou and arranging them in patterns that followed principles older than written history. Spanish moss had been woven into nets that hung between the cypress trees, their arrangement forming geometric designs that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The stumps of ancient trees had been carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and the dark water of the swamp had been seeded with substances that made it phosphoresce with unnatural light. She called to things that lived in the deep places, Trosclair continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that barely reached Dr. Dufresne's ears, things that had been sleeping in the mud and the roots since before the first people came to this land. I saw shapes moving under the water, too big to be alligators, too wrong to be anything natural. They rose up when she sang to them, and the sound they made in response, dear God, Doctor, it was like the earth itself was screaming. The hired guards had come prepared for human resistance, armed with rifles and dynamite that could destroy any obstacle made of wood and flesh. They had not come prepared for a confrontation with forces that operated according to laws that predated human understanding of the natural world. Their weapons proved useless against enemies that existed partially in the physical realm and partially in spaces that mortal minds could not fully perceive. The first man to fire his rifle, it backfired and took his hand clean off, Trosclair recounted. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that his hand, the one that got blown off, it kept moving on its own, crawling through the bottom of the boat like a spider, and he was laughing like it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen, even as the blood poured out of his stump. The dynamite that the guards had brought to blast channels through the swamp proved equally unreliable in the presence of whatever forces the swamp lady had awakened. The charges would detonate prematurely, or fail to explode at all, and when they did function as intended, the destruction they caused seemed to heal itself almost immediately. Trees that were blown apart would regrow before the men's eyes, their branches reaching across newly created gaps to restore the impenetrable canopy that protected the swamp's secrets from the outside world. She never raised her voice, Trosclair told Dr. Dufresne. Never shouted or threatened us like you might expect from someone defending their home. She just stood there on the water, her hands weaving patterns in the air, and everything around us started to change. The compass spun like a child's top, the water turned thick as molasses, and the sky, Doctor, the sky started bleeding. Real blood, red as sin, falling like rain and burning wherever it touched. One by one, the hired guards began to disappear, vanishing from their boats in broad daylight without a sound or struggle. Their weapons and equipment remained behind, but the men themselves were gone as completely as if they had never existed. Those who remained found themselves increasingly disoriented, unable to distinguish between the water and the sky, between their own memories and dreams that seemed to be planted in their minds by external forces. Time stopped making sense, Trosclair explained during another session with Dr. Dufresne. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like minutes. I watched the sun rise and set 3 times in what should have been the span of an afternoon. My companions aged years in the space of heartbeats, their hair turning white and their faces developing lines that shouldn't have been there. And through it all she kept singing, that woman singing in languages that made my teeth ache and my bones feel like they were dissolving. The few survivors of the lumber company's expedition who managed to escape the swamp told stories that varied in detail, but shared common elements that suggested a shared experience of something beyond ordinary reality. They spoke of seeing their own deaths reflected in the dark water, of conversations with family members who had been dead for years, of walking through forests that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. Jacques Boudreau, nephew of the wise woman Celestine, had served as a guide for the lumber company and was among the last to flee the supernatural chaos that erupted in the deep swamp. His account, recorded in a letter to his cousin in New Orleans, provides additional perspective on the swamp lady's methods of protecting her domain. She showed us what the land would become if the lumber company succeeded, Jacques wrote. Made us see it all. The trees cut down, the water drained away, the animals dead or driven off, the earth itself poisoned by the machines and chemicals. But she also showed us what had been here before, when the cypress trees were young and things walked between the worlds that don't walk there anymore. She made us choose, Doctor, choose between the future the lumbermen promised and the past that she could restore. The choice, according to Jacques, came with a price that few of the men were willing to pay. The swamp lady offered to spare those who would serve as guardians of the wetlands, protectors who would ensure that the ancient balance between the physical and spiritual worlds remained intact. But such service required abandoning their human identities, becoming something that existed partially in the realm of flesh and partially in the domain of spirits that dwelt in the spaces between water and earth. Some of the men accepted, Jacques confided in his letter. I saw them change, saw their skin take on the color of moss, and their eyes become like pools of dark water. They smiled as they transformed, like they had found something they had been searching for their entire lives, without knowing it. But I couldn't do it, cousin. I couldn't give up my humanity, even to save the land that had given me everything. If you're fascinated by these tales of ancient power and modern intrusion, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe, so you won't miss any of our upcoming investigations into the hidden mysteries of America's forgotten places. The story of the Swamp Lady represents a fascinating intersection between industrial progress and spiritual resistance that echoes throughout our nation's history. The aftermath of the lumber company's failed expedition sent shockwaves through the business communities of New Orleans and Baton Rouge. 7 men had entered the swamp with enough firepower to level a small town, and only 3 had emerged, all of them bearing psychological scars that would never fully heal. The company's investors, faced with inexplicable losses and reports that bordered on the supernatural, quietly abandoned their plans for developing the region and wrote off their losses as the cost of dealing with unstable local populations. But the Swamp Lady's victory came at a price that extended far beyond the immediate conflict with the lumber company. The rituals she had performed to protect her domain had awakened forces that could not easily be returned to slumber, and the entire ecosystem of the bayou began to change in ways that both fascinated and terrified the local population. Fishermen reported catches that included species unknown to scientific classification, fish with scales that glowed in the dark, amphibians that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, reptiles whose eyes held intelligence that was disturbingly human. The water itself took on properties that defied explanation, sometimes becoming so dense that boats could rest on its surface without sinking, other times becoming so thin that objects would fall through it as if it were empty air. The plant life in the Swamp Lady's territory underwent equally dramatic transformations. Cypress trees began to grow in impossible configurations, their branches intertwining to form structures that resembled Gothic cathedrals or ancient temples. Spanish moss developed luminescent properties, glowing with soft phosphorescence during the dark phases of the moon. Most remarkably, new species of vegetation appeared seemingly overnight, flowering vines that bloomed in colors that had no names, trees that bore fruit containing seeds that planted themselves and grew to maturity within hours. Local wildlife adapted to these changes with surprising speed, as if the animals possessed some instinctive understanding of the new rules that governed their environment. Alligators grew larger and more intelligent, developing what appeared to be rudimentary communication abilities and displaying problem-solving skills that challenged scientific understanding of reptilian cognition. Birds began to sing in harmonies that seemed mathematically impossible, their songs creating acoustic patterns that induced altered states of consciousness in human listeners. Dr. Marie Thibodeau, a naturalist from Tulane University who attempted to study these phenomena in 1904, found her scientific training inadequate to explain what she observed in the transformed swampland. Her research notes, preserved in the university's archives, document changes that challenged every principle of biology and physics that she had learned in her education. The very fabric of reality seems more flexible in this region, Dr. Thibodeau wrote in her most detailed report. I have observed water flowing upward, fire burning without fuel, and plants that photosynthesize moonlight instead of sunlight. Most disturbing of all, I find myself beginning to accept these impossibilities as natural phenomena, as if prolonged exposure to this environment is altering my own perception of what constitutes normal reality. Dr. Thibodeau's research was cut short when she began to exhibit the same psychological symptoms that had affected the survivors of the lumber company's expedition. She was found by colleagues from the university wandering through the French Quarter of New Orleans, speaking in languages that no linguist could identify, and claiming to have received instructions from entities that existed in the spaces between the visible and invisible worlds. The Swamp Lady herself became an increasingly elusive figure following her confrontation with the lumber company. Local residents reported occasional sightings of her tall figure moving through the cypress groves, but these encounters became less frequent as the years passed. Those who claimed to have spoken with her described a woman who seemed to be aging backward, becoming younger and more ethereal with each passing season, as if the rituals she had performed were gradually transforming her into something that belonged more to the spirit world than to the realm of flesh and blood. Père Antoine Thureau, the Catholic priest who served the scattered communities of the Bayou region, made several attempts to approach the Swamp Lady during this period, driven by concern for her spiritual welfare and curiosity about the nature of the forces she had unleashed. His journal entries from these encounters reveal a man struggling to reconcile his religious training with phenomena that seemed to operate according to principles that predated Christian theology. "She receives me with courtesy but not warmth," Père Thureau wrote after his first meeting with the mysterious woman. "Her French is perfect, yet archaic, and she speaks of spiritual matters with the authority of someone who has witnessed truths that are not contained in any scripture I know. When I offer to hear her confession, she smiles and asks what sins could possibly matter to someone who has already died and been reborn in service to forces older than sin itself." The priest's subsequent visits revealed increasingly unsettling aspects of the Swamp Lady's transformation. She spoke casually of events that had occurred decades before her apparent arrival in the region, demonstrated knowledge of local families' histories that she could not have acquired through ordinary means, and displayed abilities that challenged Père Thureau's understanding of the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds. "She showed me visions of what this land was like before the first Europeans arrived," the priest recorded after his final visit. "I saw it through her eyes, or perhaps through the eyes of something that had witnessed its creation. The cypress trees were temples, the waterways were veins carrying the lifeblood of something vast and ancient, and the boundary between the world of spirits and the world of flesh was so thin as to be meaningless. She told me that the lumbermen's attack had not been defeated but merely deflected, that greater threats were coming, and that the protection of this place would require sacrifices that few mortals would willingly make." By 1905, the Swamp Lady's territory had become a place that existed partially outside the normal flow of time and causality. Visitors who entered the region often emerged with memories of events that had not yet occurred or had happened decades in the past. Some returned bearing knowledge of future events that proved startlingly accurate, while others brought back artifacts from time periods that did not match the contemporary world. The local communities adapted to these phenomena with the pragmatic acceptance that characterized their ancestors' response to the challenges of life in an environment that operated according to its own mysterious rules. They established informal protocols for dealing with the temporal anomalies that surrounded the Swamp Lady's domain, learning to recognize the signs that indicated when the boundaries between past, present, and future had become particularly fluid. Children born in the region during this period displayed unusual abilities that seemed to be connected to the transformed nature of their environment. They could communicate with animals in ways that went beyond simple training, demonstrated intuitive understanding of weather patterns and natural cycles that impressed even experienced trappers and fishermen, and occasionally displayed what could only be described as prophetic abilities. Marie Boudreau, daughter of the guide Jacques, was born in 1904 and grew up on the edges of the Swamp Lady's territory. Her childhood memories, recorded in interviews conducted in the 1960s, provide insight into how the local population learned to coexist with the supernatural forces that had been awakened by the lumber company's invasion. "We knew which parts of the bayou were safe and which parts belonged to her," Marie recalled. "The safe places looked normal, felt normal, smelled normal. But her places, they were different. The air itself was thicker there, and you could feel things watching you from between the trees. Not hostile things exactly, but things that were deciding whether you belonged there or not." Marie's accounts describe a childhood spent navigating between the ordinary world of her family's daily life and the transformed realm where the Swamp Lady's influence held sway. Children who wandered too far into the protected territory would sometimes return with gifts, carved trinkets made from wood that didn't match any known species, flowers that retained their bloom indefinitely, or small stones that glowed with inner light when held by their recipients. "She never spoke to us directly," Marie remembered, "but she left messages. Patterns made from cypress knees arranged in our path, or moss woven into shapes that meant things we somehow understood without being taught. My grand-mère said she was teaching us the old language, the one that people used before they forgot how to listen to the land itself. The period between 1905 and 1910 marked the height of the Swamp Lady's influence over the region. During these years, the protected territory expanded gradually, encompassing additional waterways and forest areas as the supernatural ecosystem that she had created continued to evolve and grow. Land developers and industrial interests learned to avoid the region entirely, deterred by reports of inexplicable equipment failures, worker disappearances, and encounters with phenomena that defied rational explanation. Government officials who attempted to survey the area for tax assessment purposes found their efforts consistently thwarted by factors that ranged from the merely inconvenient to the genuinely terrifying. Surveyors' instruments would malfunction without cause, producing readings that suggested the landscape was constantly shifting and changing. Maps drawn of the region proved unreliable, with waterways appearing and disappearing between visits, and landmarks relocating themselves in defiance of all geographic logic. State records from this period contain numerous reports of officials who entered the Swamp Lady's territory, only to emerge days later with no clear memory of their experiences and a profound reluctance to discuss what they had encountered. These accounts, buried in bureaucratic files and largely forgotten, reveal a pattern of governmental acceptance that the region had become effectively autonomous, operating according to principles that state authority could neither understand nor control. The veil between worlds grows thinner with each mystery we explore together. Subscribe now to our channel to continue uncovering these hidden chapters of American history, and share in the comments which forgotten corners of our nation you believe might harbor similar secrets. Your engagement helps keep these extraordinary stories alive for future generations to discover and ponder. The beginning of the end of the Swamp Lady's era came not from external threats, but from the inexorable passage of time and the gradual changes that modernity brought to even the most isolated regions of Louisiana. The construction of improved roads and the arrival of automobiles made the Bayou country more accessible to outsiders, while advances in communication technology began to connect the scattered communities to the broader world in ways that their isolation had previously prevented. Young people from the local families began to leave for opportunities in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and even more distant cities, drawn by the promise of jobs that didn't require navigating the complex spiritual landscape that had come to characterize their homeland. The old knowledge that had been passed down through generations of swamp dwellers began to fade as fewer children remained to learn the subtle signs and unspoken protocols that governed life in the Swamp Lady's domain. By 1915, the supernatural phenomena that had once been commonplace in the region began to diminish in frequency and intensity. The temporal anomalies became less pronounced, the transformed wildlife gradually reverted to more familiar forms, and the phosphorescent properties of the water and vegetation faded to the point where they were barely noticeable except during the darkest nights of the lunar cycle. The Swamp Lady herself became increasingly ethereal during these years, appearing less frequently to human observers and seeming to exist more completely in the realm of spirits than in the world of flesh and blood. The last confirmed sighting of her occurred in the spring of 1918, when young Henri Boudreau, grandson of the wise woman Celestine, encountered her while checking his family's trap lines in the deep swamp. She was standing waist-deep in the dark water, Henri told his family upon his return, but the water wasn't touching her somehow. It flowed around her like she was made of air. She looked at me for a long time, and I felt like she was seeing everything I had ever done and everything I would ever do. Then she smiled, and when she did, I understood that her work here was finished. According to Henri's account, the Swamp Lady spoke to him in the old French that his grandmother had used, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones rather than his ears. She told him that the immediate danger to the land had passed, that the forces she had awakened would continue to protect the swamp for generations to come, but that her active guardianship was no longer necessary. She said the land itself had learned to defend against those who would harm it, Henri reported. The cypress trees would remember how to move, the water would remember how to rise and fall according to its own will, and the spirits that dwelt in the spaces between the visible and invisible worlds would continue to watch over everything that lived and grew in the wetlands. The Swamp Lady's final message, delivered through Henri to the scattered communities of the Bayou region, was both a blessing and a warning. She promised that the protective influences she had established would endure as long as the local population maintained their respect for the delicate balance between the human and natural worlds. But she also cautioned that future generations of developers and exploiters would come, armed with technologies and legal authorities that surpassed anything the lumber company had possessed, and that the land's defenses would need to evolve to meet these new challenges. Tell them, she instructed Henri, that the price of protection is remembrance. As long as someone remembers the old ways, remembers how to listen to the land and respect its autonomy, the barriers between worlds will remain strong. But if the memory fades, if the people forget that they are guests rather than masters in this place, then the protection will fade as well, and the land will become vulnerable once again. Henry's encounter marked the end of the Swamp Lady's visible presence in the region, but her influence continued to be felt for decades to come. The territory she had protected retained its character as a place where the normal rules of reality operated with unusual flexibility, where wildlife displayed behaviors that seemed to indicate unusual intelligence, and where sensitive individuals could still occasionally glimpse forms moving between the trees that belonged to no known species. Modern attempts to document the Swamp Lady's story have been complicated by the passage of time and the reluctance of local families to share their memories with outsiders. The oral traditions that preserved the most detailed accounts of her methods and motivations were gradually lost as the communities that had supported them dispersed or assimilated into the broader culture of 20th century Louisiana. Environmental scientists who have studied the region in recent decades have noted persistent anomalies that suggest the Swamp Lady's interventions had lasting effects on the local ecosystem. Certain areas continue to support plant and animal populations that exist nowhere else in Louisiana, and water quality measurements occasionally produce readings that don't match the chemical composition of surrounding wetlands. Dr. James Theriot, a hydrologist from Louisiana State University, who conducted extensive research in the area during the 1970s, documented several phenomena that defied conventional scientific explanation. His published papers, while carefully avoiding supernatural interpretations, describe water that flows in patterns that contradict known principles of hydraulics, soil compositions that include elements not found elsewhere in the region, and acoustic properties that allow sounds to carry over much greater distances than atmospheric conditions should permit. There's something about this particular stretch of bayou that doesn't quite fit the models, Dr. Theriot wrote in his most comprehensive study of the region. The ecosystem functions according to principles that seem to operate independently of the broader environmental patterns that characterize the Atchafalaya Basin. It's almost as if this area exists within its own microclimate of possibility, where the usual constraints of physics and biology have been relaxed just enough to allow for outcomes that wouldn't be sustainable elsewhere. The Swamp Lady's legacy extends beyond the environmental anomalies that mark her former domain. Local folklore has preserved fragments of the knowledge she shared with the communities that surrounded her territory, techniques for predicting weather patterns, methods of communication with wildlife, and healing practices that incorporate elements not found in conventional medicine or traditional Creole folk remedies. These practices continue to be used by some of the older residents of the Bayou region, though they are increasingly rare as the cultural traditions that supported them fade into history. Visiting anthropologists and folklorists have documented some of these techniques, but their academic descriptions inevitably fail to capture the subtle intuitions and environmental awareness that make the practices effective in the hands of experienced practitioners. The story of the Swamp Lady represents one of the most thoroughly documented cases of successful resistance to industrial exploitation in American history. Yet it remains largely unknown outside the communities that experienced it directly. Her methods of protection challenged every assumption about the relationship between human society and the natural world, demonstrating that the boundaries between the possible and impossible are far more flexible than conventional wisdom suggests. Perhaps most significantly, her story illustrates the price that such protection requires, not just from those who serve as guardians, but from entire communities that must choose between the safety of familiar limitations and the uncertain possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of ordinary reality. The Swamp Lady's ritual was ultimately not about magic or supernatural power, but about the willingness to sacrifice individual identity in service of something larger and more enduring than any single human life. Today, the wetlands that the Swamp Lady died to protect remain largely intact, though they face new threats from climate change, industrial pollution, and urban development that operate on scales she could never have imagined. Yet local residents continue to report encounters with phenomena that suggest her influence endures in subtler forms: protective instincts that guide them away from dangerous areas, intuitive knowledge of weather patterns that saves lives during hurricane season, and occasional glimpses of a tall figure moving between the cypress trees when the mist rises from the dark water and the boundary between worlds grows thin. The rituals she performed to protect her land may have ended over a century ago, but their effects continue to ripple through time, reminding us that the relationship between humanity and nature is far more complex and mysterious than our modern world typically acknowledges. In the end, perhaps the Swamp Lady's greatest achievement was not the supernatural defenses she erected around her territory, but the demonstration that such defenses were possible at all, that the living world possesses resources for resistance that transcend anything our science or law can comprehend or control.